FIFA football tournaments. He has served or worked with all national football teams, and in recent times have been very instrumental in keeping our soca warriors healthy at their 2006 World Cup in Germany. Dr. Barbour is also a lecturer in the Department of Paraclinical Sciences here at the University of the West Indies, and he operates his own rehabilitation center at the Center of Excellence, where he's frequently visited by a lot of athletes. Dr. Barbour has sought out to determine the incidence of injury, location, nature, and mechanism of injury for amateur women footballers in Trinidad and Tobago. Therefore, he will now present for us an audit of injuries sustained in the Trinidad and Tobago Women's Football League. Dr. Barbour.
Thank you very much, Kerry. Okay, so thank you, organizers, for this opportunity to present at this conference here. So, as he said, I'll be doing an audit of injuries into the Women's Amateur Football League in Trinidad and Tobago. Left, enter. Okay, good. So, right, women's football. FIFA has estimated in 2012 that over 400 million women play football. And most of them, as could be seen here, are amateur, whereas less than a fraction of a percent play football professionally. So a little bit on the background here. The epidemiology of injury, that is the nature, the incidence of injury, and so in men's football, seem to be well documented. Men's professional leagues around the world, FIFA tournaments, national teams done. There's a lot of information available on that. But at the amateur leagues levels, in men's football, there's a paucity of data. Women's football, at the same time, the epidemiology really has lagged behind that of the male. There are few studies published on women's football, and those are at the FIFA World Tournaments, some elite professional women's leagues in like Scandinavia and the US. But again, there's a paucity of data for amateur women's football data. There's one study located in the US among the college soccer, and there were no studies done in developing countries. Okay, this brings us to the question here of the playing and training surfaces. By and large, most football or soccer, as they call it in the US, were played on like grass surfaces. But over the last 30 or 40 years, with inclement weather, very low temperatures, there's been a proliferation in a number of teams that use artificial turf for their games. So this one here is grass, and this is our Marvin Lee here. This is in South Africa. This is our artificial turf, and this is one of the newer generation artificial turfs. And those are the two. Now, there was a lot of concern based on data that was presented probably 30, 40 years ago when the initial artificial turfs were really astroturf. There were a lot of injuries associated with that. And as a result of that, there has been a lot of interest on whether playing on these artificial surfaces really increase injury or not. Present data suggests that there is no significant differences in acute injuries in male and female and youth and adult players who play and train on artificial turf when compared to grass. However, in Japan, it was found that adolescents who played and trained a lot on artificial turf, they had a higher reported incidence of low back pain. Right. So with this in mind, what was the aim of this study? The aim was really to find out the incidence of injury occurring in the Trinidad and Tobago Women Football League for the inaugural season in 2009. And finding that out, was there a difference in the incidence of injury in people who play games on artificial turf versus grass? And thirdly, are players who play and train predominantly on one type of surface, for example, if they train and play most of their home games on artificial turf, are they at increased risk when they go out to play on grass? Now, this question hasn't been answered in the literature available for now, so we should get some data on that. So the methods, the Trinidad and Tobago Women's Football League, there are two divisions, a Premier Division and a Developmental Division. This was a study looking at the Premier Division, where the better players would have been, or the more skilled players would have registered. This league ran from May to August. Games were held once weekly. Permissions were gained from the Trinidad and Tobago Football Federation and the team managers or owners. We met with the team physios and trainers before the league and explained the rationale for the study. And most of the games happened on weekends. So the Monday after the game, they were called and data, anonymized data, injury data, location of injury, age of the player who was injured, new or recurrent injury, the time of the injury, the surface type where the player got injured, the mechanism of injury, and the estimated and actual time out resulting from this injury. These were all collected by a research assistant. 2 teams played their home games and did about 2/3 of their training on artificial turf. And they are Joe Public, the women's team, and at that time, the national Trinidad and Tobago under-17 women's team. They did most of their training and played their home games there at the artificial turf. And 6 teams played their home games and training on grass. Players give informed signed consent to use their anonymized data for research purposes. The methods in documenting injuries in football have been standardized by the work of Fuller et al. In 2007. So there's a standardized way to record so we can be able to compare data among teams that use a similar methodology. Data was put into SPSS 21. The frequencies of independent variables were achieved. Chi-square was used for association between categorical variables. And when the sample sizes were small, the Fisher's exact test was done. And a p-value of less than 5% was considered significant. A definition of injury from that: an injury in football is defined as any trauma resulting from football itself, regardless of the time, or from training or games. There are some people who get injured today and tomorrow they're able to play or train, and these are referred to as zero-day injuries, meaning that they were just injured on that day, but they were able to play. Some studies have used the time of injury. That is somebody who got injured today and misses at least 1 day of playing or training. So that is based on the work by Fuller et al. So what were the results? So we had a 68% response rate. Out of the 8 teams, 1 team refused to give any data, and then some of the data we missed out on the other games. So we got data for 57 of the 84. In that time, we had 29 injuries in 57 games, which equated to 940.5 hours. So the incident rate of injuries was worked out to be 30.8 per 1,000 player hours. And that would have been the total number of injuries. If we were to eliminate those players who were able to play on the next day, if we were to took out the zero-time injuries, then the incidence of injuries turned out to be about 27.6 per 1,000 player hours. So this is the age distribution here. We see that just slightly more than half were over 20 years old. Location of injury, well, no wonder they call it football, because a lot of the injuries happen on the foot and the ankle, and so nearly 3/4 of the injuries. Mechanism of injury, non-contact, contact. So non-contact was slightly more than contact. But just bear in mind this figure of 45%, because we'll be using it again to part of the discussion. Type of injury, most injuries, 3/4 of the injuries were new, 25% were recurrent. When did the injury occur? Now, football is a game of halves, so what we did, we just broken up in the early first half, early second half. And what we see, the peak injury rate here happened in the late second half, and the second percent, about a third, happened in the late part of the first half. Again, this is consistent with other studies done around the world, but this late second half here could account for differences in physical fitness, nutrition, dehydration, that sort of thing. So if we were to cross-tabulate now, and we look at when did the injury happen, together with the mechanism of injury, what we see here is that the second half of the games, there were more contact injuries. And the first half of the game, there appeared to be more non-contact injuries. And again, this was significant between contact and non-contact across the halves of the game. Severity of injuries. Well, based on the definition by Fuller, there are 0-day injuries. These were people who were able to play the next day. Mild injuries, these were able to recover within 7 days. Moderate injuries, these recovered sometime between 8 and 28 days. And severe injuries, which happened to be one ACL and one ankle injury, they took more than 28 days to recover. So it shows that most of the injuries happening in football are really generally mild. Right, one of the aims we looked at was people who train and play the majority of games on one type of surface. When they move to another type of surface, are they more at risk for injury? Now, my hypothesis before would have been that people play and train most of their games on artificial turf. When they go out on grass to play, should get injured more. And people who train and play on grass, when they go on artificial turf to play, they should have been injured more. But strangely, that's what we found here, that persons who played their home games and most training on artificial turf, they suffered less injuries when they played on grass. Now, bearing in mind there's a small sample size, but that was significant. As opposed to persons who trained and played most of their home games on grass, there was no difference when they went out in terms of injury rate when they go to play on artificial turf. So the major finding of this study would have been that people who play their home games and do most of their training on artificial turf, when they went out to grass, they were at a lower risk of becoming injured. There were no significant differences in the injury rate between games played on artificial turf and grass. That has been consistent with other studies done. So let's look at the discussion. Let's compare some of our injuries here with some around the world, right? It's very important when you're doing epidemiology of injuries that you compare studies with a similar definition of injury. So, okay. So, I mean, by and large, from 2007, all studies would have had a total injury rate. And then you break it up into 0 days and time loss. So Trinidad, our injury, if we look at time loss, would have been somewhere around 28. Norway would have been about 23. This is the Norway Professional League. The US college, with a similar definition, and they didn't add in 0 days. They just looked at time loss. And there's almost 60 injuries per 1,000 play hours. And FIFA, although their incidence of injury would have been about 65, and this would have been at the Female World Cup, this would have been at really elite tournaments, or about 68 per 1,000. When we eliminate 0-day injuries, it comes around 30, which is really, by and large, similar here. Now, if you were to, what are some of the things that could explain some of this here would have been contact injury. In our society, in our league, our contact injury rate was about 44%. So 44% of people who got injured had some kind of contact with another player. Now, in those studies with very high injury rates, like FIFA and so, 84% contact, 75% in the US colleges. So that's one of the major contributing factors, the mechanism by which these players got injured. Right? Our causation, one of the causes would have been contact. 45% would have been associated with these injuries. Other possible reasons, physical fatigue. In the second half, most of the injuries happen. Contact, people dehydrated, fatigued, and not only players, referees become so, and they make bad decisions and so on, could have led to more contact injuries in the second half. So as we said, players who play on artificial turf, they suffered less injuries when they went into play on grass. This mechanism was unexpected, unknown. Now, Taylor found in 2012 that players who play on artificial turf, their ankles develop greater forces, ankle and feet, and then greater torque forces generated while playing on artificial turf as opposed to grass. So maybe this increased torque and increased force generation, playing on artificial or training on artificial turf, would have led to greater adaptations of the proprioceptors in these ankles, such that when they do go out onto grass to play, it may have been a protective factor against injury. But this is just a speculation. Right, again, similar injury rate with artificial and turf, so no greater set of injuries. So this is limited by a small sample size. The findings should only be extrapolated to amateur women's football. And findings could be extrapolated to players who play on this new generation artificial turf, not the older AstroTurf, and so that we have. So the conclusion, the incident of injury in the Trinidad and Tobago Women's League is essentially similar to other professional women's leagues around the world. Again, we said people who play on and train on artificial turfs, evidently, I mean, there's a real small study. We need a larger study to suggest, but it suggests and is significant that they have a lower incidence of injury playing on grass. And I mean, we need to implement, I mean, we all spoke about it, Anil spoke about it. We need to bring about some form of implementation of some injury prevention strategies. Better nutrition and hydration for our players, because these are players who work in the day and then train in the evening and then play their games on the weekend, party time. FIFA now has brought out this FIFA injury prevention program, which seems to be reducing our injuries by about 33 to 35% in women's football. So maybe, I mean, this has been started with some of the groups in the national football team. Well, we have questions for after, but I think just as this is my final slide here, we can't have anything in Trinidad on football without paying tribute to Hakeem Adams. I haven't been able to go to his funeral because of this appointment. But I can speak that Hakeem was one of the nicest guys you'd ever meet, good family background, good values. I hope he rests in peace. We'll ask questions and so after. Thank you very much.